Did you know that you needed another hex grid turn-based 4X strategy game tracing human history through the ages? Well, I didn't. Apparently, though, the gaming industry did because they gave us Humankind. Is this the civilization-buster you're looking for, or is it a Me Too wannabe in an otherwise crowded space? Watch on and find out. My name is Thoraxe, and this is Strategy for Busy People. If you've got a few minutes, I'll tell you what to play. I've got an awful lot of hours in Civ games. 50 plus hours in Civ 4. Another 5 hours in Civ 4 Colonization, which doesn't include God knows how many hours I put into the original Colonization when that first came out. 30 hours in Civ 5, and I'll probably hit Civ 6 at some point. So why am I talking so much about Civilization? Because if you squint just right, Humankind by Amplitude Studios is a weird Civilization clone. Now, how much of this is being Civ-like versus being 4X-like is up for debate. In some ways, Civilization pioneered many of the game mechanics and defined the genre of trace human history in a strategy game. But in other ways, there has always been room for disruption. How does Humankind shake out? 7.5 hours of gameplay should tell you something, if you know me. Now, granted, this entire playtime was in the tutorial, which is a relatively simple scenario, but it is extremely telling about the manner in which this game plays. But the tutorial is important because, at least in comparison to the Civ 5 I remember, Humankind offers quite a few more levers to pull. In a similar trope, though, the starting game involves choosing a culture where each culture has its own special buffs, resources, technologies, tactics, or other specialities. Depending on when you start the game, different cultures might be available, or not available, roughly following how history actually went. That brings us to the concept of eras, which are a key differentiator to the game from Civilization. Only certain technologies, units, buildings, and other things specific to the era, for example, the Ancient Era, are available during that era. Unlike in Civ, you can't tech race and end up with spaceships fighting barbarians because you can't get space tech while the game is still in the Ancient Era. Advancing through the eras requires collecting certain stars that are related to both the era itself, as well as your specific chosen culture. Unlike in your typical Civilization game, you also can't just spam out cities in Humankind. Similar to what we recently saw in my review of Dune Spice Wars, claiming new territory requires spending influence, or other resources, potentially depending on your civilization type. You have a city cap, too, with the requisite penalties for going over that cap, but the ability to grow the cap through various investments that we'll talk about later. Also, as your empire begins to sprawl, various debuffs begin to take hold that make things harder to manage. Interestingly, you don't have to have cities in order to gain advantages from expanding your reach. Placing outposts in a territory can feed back to neighboring cities, giving you various resource benefits, but without the overhead of a full-blown city. However, more cities mean more production of units and other production facilities, so picking and choosing when to expand becomes an important part of your strategic planning. Speaking of units, that's another area where you're unlikely to be riding the spam train. It seems that the total number of units you will be dealing with in Humankind is generally going to be lower, and, depending on various levers in the game, you cannot even have a very large group of them. For example, in my initial playthrough, the stack size was roughly limited to 4 units. All the typical 4X tropes for units are there, with terrain buffs and debuffs, movement points, and so forth. One difference that Humankind brings to the table is the ability to control the battle at the unit level more directly, instead of a giant dice-rolling exercise pitting stats on stats. That doesn't mean you can't roll the dice, but you're not forced to if you want a little more control. Expanding your city should feel similar to veteran Civ players, with certain resource-producing capacities available, a limited number of expansion slots, various resources on the ground that your buildings can exploit, and so on and so forth. There is a slightly unique nuance to cities in Humankind, though I think that Civ 6 added something similar. And that is the difference between districts and infrastructures. Districts are, as you might think from the name, areas around your city that you can expand that allow you to produce more resources. Infrastructures, in comparison, are specific buildings that also produce resources, but you can only have so many of each of districts and infrastructures. So again, balance and planning are key. As is expected, one of the resources that can be produced is a form of scientific research that leads us into the tech tree. You've seen this kind of thing before. Early tech builds on itself to grant later tech in the form of unit types, building types, and so on and so forth. This is nothing new, and it is executed in a pretty typical manner. That's neither bad nor good, it just is. Another slightly unique game mechanic is that of civics, which are specific cultural choices that you can make at various points in the game throughout your development. The two-sided choices will lead your civilization towards different quote-unquote styles, if you will, and typically provide some bonus or another. For example, choosing between criminal slavery versus war slavery will result in different production bonuses. These civic choices are also related to the era advancement that we discussed earlier. Civic choices appear to be permanent, though, so, choose wisely, I guess. And what would a thoraxe civilization builder type game be without a diplomacy screen? Well, probably not much of one, I guess. And you guessed it, no real surprises here. However, the one interesting surprise as it relates to diplomacy is that you can't just willy-nilly go to war with an opponent. Similar to other games where a casus belli or reason for war is required, you need a certain level of war support to both enter into and maintain a war with an opponent. And eventually, when war support runs out, your war ends, whether you want it to or not. Before I give my final verdict, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to share with your friends. Agree with me? Disagree with me? Or want to see other content? Let me know in the comments below. Want to try this game yourself? Check out my humble affiliate link below. And if you want to support me in making more of these videos, become a patron on Patreon. Your support really makes a difference. The final verdict. While the game has some weird hitches that aren't readily obvious, like how to trade goods with other players, overall it is extremely solid. If you're looking for a different flavor of 4X Civ Builder because you're tired of the tried and true Civilization series, Humankind may placate your desire for many 100-turn epic matchups. On my trademarked 3-point score scale of avoid, meh, and I forgot to eat, the amber waves of grain loomed large, my swollen influence bursting at the seams, and my production capacity was huge. Trust me, it was enormous. But that dinner bell was more of a siren song than the fate of humanity, and my opponents could muster, so I abandoned my tribe for greener pastures. And a pastrami sandwich. But the game was alright.